Okay, good morning. We are starting our chapter 7 reading today. Yesterday we talked about the key terms. So our steamboat is that boat powered by a steam engine. That's the way that a lot of settlers got to Minnesota when it was a territory. U.S. Congress is the people who make the laws for the U.S. There are elected representatives from the state, all states and territories. It's divided into the Senate and the House of Representatives. The governor is the head of the executive branch in the state or territory. Remember, there are 3 branches of government: executive, legislator, which would be Congress making laws, and the judicial, which would be the courts. A state is the geographic area with boundaries, residents, and a government with a constitution and laws. Immigrant is the person who comes into a country to live there. The recruiter is somebody who encourages new people to join a group. The Constitution is the written document outlining how the government of a state or country is organized. And federalism is when the government power is split between the national federal government and the states, which is what we have. So again, we are going quickly through this reading because Mr. Boyle is going to come talk to us about Extreme Faith Camp. So for my friends at home, we're going to be kind of rushing through it. If you need to slow down and take your time, you can. And just know that he is recruiting people for Extreme Faith Camp. So be thinking about if that is something you are interested in. Page 126. Until about 1850, most of the people living in Minnesota were Dakota and Ojibwe. By the 1860s, though, European American settlers were in the majority. Remember, once the treaties were signed and the land switched to ownership, lots of settlers came in, and now the settlers were outnumbering the American Indians. They took over the land of the Dakota and the Ojibwe with incredible speed. Before the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota were signed in 1851, about 6,000 European Americans were living in Minnesota. By 1854, their number had increased to 30,000. So 24,000 more people. By 1857, their population topped 150,000. So look at those increases. It went up by 24,000. Then it went up by 120,000 in just a few years. Yes, sir? In your locker or at home? So listen, okay? You can follow along with Zoe if you want to follow along, or just listen. Remember to bring it tomorrow. Between 1849 and 1858, Minnesota was the fastest growing place in the United States. It had become one of the most popular destinations in a great migration of people from east to west, known as the Westward Expansion. Talked about that the last chapter. When Minnesota Territory was created, its American Indian population was far greater than that of the European American newcomers. It didn't stay that way for long, though. A government official, the U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs, kept population records of Native people. According to these records, there were more than 31,000 American Indian people living in and around Minnesota Territory in the early 1850s. Settlers were arriving so fast that by 1855, they outnumbered the Native people who lived there. As more and more people arrived, Minnesota changed in countless ways. Life was becoming very different for all the people who lived in this place, not only for the Dakota and the Ojibwe who had been here for centuries, but also for the newcomers who were arriving by the steamboat load. Transportation in early Minnesota. Before the 1800s, there had been 2 main ways to travel through Minnesota: by foot or by canoe. By the 1850s, people had a few more choices. In 1847, steamboats started making regular stops at the village of St. Paul. The boats carried people and supplies. Great numbers of immigrants took trains from the East Coast to Mississippi River, towns such as Galena, Illinois, and then boarded steamboats bound for Minnesota. The boats could run only from April April to November when the river was clear of ice. So people were coming in mostly during during the spring, summer, and fall. They weren't coming so much in the wintertime when it was too icy. Those who wanted to travel to Minnesota during the winter could take a horse-drawn stagecoach from Galena, but it would be a longer trip. The journey could take up to 6 days compared to only 2 days on the steamboat. Snowstorms often made travel impossible and forced passengers and their drivers to find lodging in cabins of friendly strangers. The ox cart was another common form of transportation by the 1840s. It was used mainly by the Métis people of the Red River Valley in northern Minnesota and Canada. The Métis used the ox carts to transport furs, buffalo skins, and other goods from the Red River Valley to St. Paul. A train of ox carts could make the trip in 30 to 40 days. So that's a long time for them to be traveling because the ox go slowly. They don't go as fast as the steamboat. Finn?
The 30 to 40 days kind of reminds me of something. And I think I know what that something is.
What, Finn?
The Oregon Trail.
Okay. All right. The New England school teacher. In July 1847, a young woman named Harriet Bishop stepped off the steamboat Argo and onto the landing at the small settlement of St. Paul along the Mississippi River. Several children were there to greet her when she arrived. She had come to be their new teacher, their first school teacher. What were they doing if they weren't in school before? Maddie?
Probably working on the farm.
Working on the farms. Okay, we talked about that's how the American Indian children were learning. It was more of a hands-on learning. They weren't in a classroom. They were learning the skills that they needed to survive. So that's what the pioneer children were doing. Those first settlers, they were learning how to work the land. But now they have a teacher coming. Bishop had grown up in Vermont and had trained to become a teacher, one of the few careers open to women at that time. Teaching jobs were hard for women to find on the East Coast, but an organization called the National Board of Popular Education was looking for women to start schools in newly settled lands to the west. Bishop jumped at the chance. Her assignment was to teach the children of St. Paul, which had no school. St. Paul was hardly even a town in 1847. Think about how big it is now as our capital city. It's a big city. It's a metropolis. Back then, it was tiny. The buildings were mostly just log huts. The streets were bumpy and muddy. A few hundred people lived there, and most of them were men. Only a dozen or so families with school-aged children lived in the area. About half the parents had never learned to read. So a lot of the parents had never gone to school. Harriet Bishop knew that teaching children under these circumstances would not be easy, but she seemed to relish the challenge. Here was a field to be cultivated, she later recalled, a garden of untrained flowers to be tended, and the heart raised a thank offering to heaven and cheerfully entered upon its work. So she was excited to come to this place where people truly wanted her so they could learn. A school for St. Paul. Bishop's new school was an abandoned blacksmith shop. Mud plaster held the log walls together. Small dirty windows let in hardly any sunlight. Rats and snakes lurked in the corners. She got to work. She cleaned up her schoolroom as best she could and decorated the walls with evergreen branches. Bishop seemed to enjoy her new surroundings. Why should I pine for halls of science and literature when such glorious privileges are mine, she wrote. There was not a spot in Earth's broad domain that could have tempted me to an exchange. She's saying, I don't need some fancy school. This is what it's all about. This is the best place for me to be. 3 days after arriving in St. Paul, Bishop opened her little schoolhouse. Her first class had 9 students, though only 2 of them spoke English. Because remember, they were immigrants coming from other countries. So they spoke their native country's language. The others spoke a variety of languages, including French, Dakota, German, and Ojibwe. One of Bishop's students spoke 3 languages and became her interpreter. Strong feelings. In addition to teaching, Harriet Bishop was involved in her community in many other ways. She established St. Paul's first Sunday school. She helped organize a group whose members believed that drinking alcohol was harmful and should be illegal. She also led several women's organizations that raised money for community projects. Bishop believed that all these efforts would help civilize the people of Minnesota. Harriet Bishop was just one of a growing number of New Englanders, people from the far northeastern states who were moving to Minnesota. Many of these newcomers had worked in the lumber industry in Maine and New Hampshire, and they were now looking to make their fortunes off the vast timberlands of Wisconsin and Minnesota. Like Bishop, these New Englanders often had strong feelings about American democracy, culture, education, and religion. They had plans for Minnesota's future. Many of these New Englanders became leaders in the towns that were developing along Minnesota's rivers. Because there were so many newcomers from this region of the United States, Minnesota is often called the New England of the West. So New England is on the East Coast where people were first settling from England, so it was New England. Now Minnesota was the new place for people to settle, so they called it New England of the West. 3 branches of government. The federal or national government of the United States has its power divided among 3 branches. They are called the legislative, executive, and judicial. Each branch has a specific role, and all 3 must work together to keep the government running. When Minnesota became a territory in 1849, 2 of the branches played a role in its establishment. So if we look down below, they have the breakup of the 3 branches, which we talked about yesterday. The legislative makes the laws with Congress and the Senate and House of Representatives. The executive enforces laws with the president and the vice president, the cabinet, and then to the states where the governors are and the mayors. Then we have the judicial interprets the laws. They uphold the laws and make sure people are following the law as it should be. So interpreting the law, determining what it actually stands for. So that would be the Supreme Court and all the other courts. So go back to page 129. People are people. When you read about Harriet Bishop, who lived more than 150 years ago, you might think, so what? You might be surprised to learn that people today still have strong feelings about her. Some appreciate the positive things Bishop did to improve the community of St. Paul. Others have a negative opinion of her because she said hurtful things about the Dakota people who lived nearby. Harriet Bishop, like all people, was complicated. Both the positive and negative reactions to her deeds make sense if we view them from a different perspective. She helped her community. In the 1850s, when St. Paul was just getting started by European American settlers, Bishop was a leader who helped shape this new community. She loved her chosen home and once said, if earth has a paradise, it is here. Because it's just so beautiful in Minnesota. I agree. Bishop devoted most of her life to finding ways to make it better. To her, this meant creating opportunities for women. It also meant promoting certain values and beliefs. She participated in at least 8 organizations, including the St. Paul Circle of Industry, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. Many people benefited from Bishop's care and hard work. But she said hurtful things about Dakota people. In chapter 9, you're going to learn about a war. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 was a painful time in our state's history. It still has an impact on Minnesotans today, and it had a powerful effect on the people who lived through it, including Harriet Bishop. Like most people who see war firsthand, Bishop ended up having very strong feelings about it. In 1863, she wrote a book called Dakota War or Indian Massacres and War in Minnesota. In it, she called Dakota soldiers names like savage, inhuman monster, and heartless wretch. Bishop's words were influenced by the fear and anger she felt as a result of living in a place that experienced the violence of war. So the terms that she was using because she was afraid. Because what she saw in wartime was scary. Are all people like that? No. So we need to understand her perspective was coming from a place of fear because it was wartime. Today, though, some believe words like hers contributed to misunderstandings of what really happened in this war. At the time, people were divided over this issue, and that divide still exists today. And we're going to learn more about that war coming up. People are people. Harriet Bishop did things that affected some people positively and some negatively. In this way, she is like most people who are more complicated than they might seem. So it's what we've been talking about, the different perspectives that people have. It's complicated. Kira?
Isn't this also tied to prohibition? Because you mentioned alcohol.
It does. Prohibition comes in the early 1900s, so we're leading up to it. So that's coming. So we're going to stop the recording here because, like I told my friends at home, Mr. Boyle's going to be talking about Extreme Faith Camp. So make sure that you look into that when you come back, and we hope you are doing well. Have a good day.